Hey, I'm Tommy Ellison, and this is Senior Moments. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but I remember every detail of that time I came this close to being suspended my senior year in high school, just 3 weeks before graduation. So stick around. This is proof that some things from a misspent youth just don't fade away. Let's go. Well, hello, and good morning. Good afternoon. This is Tommy Ellison, and this is Senior Moments, Evidence of a Misspent Youth, and I am happy to be with you here tonight. I hope you are enjoying the weekend and looking forward to a short week coming up with Thanksgiving, and I don't know about you, but I certainly have more than plenty things to be thankful for, and one of them is you who are watching, and thank you for your support, and I hope that tonight's little broadcast will be meaningful to you. I'm going to be talking about my favorite movies, and you know, movies, they have a funny way of really shaping us and certainly affecting us, you know, not only emotionally, but mentally and sometimes even spiritually. And I've got 4 movies that kind of have always affected me emotionally. And whenever I kind of get down and I want to just kind of lift my spirits, there's 4 movies that I love to watch, and well, let me just show you what those are. There's 4 of them. There's Hoosiers, which you know, if you're not familiar with that movie, it's well, I'll get into that in just a second. But Hoosiers, and then there's the movie Woodlawn, and then Remember the Titans. And of course, the cult classic, Rudy. And Rudy is probably, you know, one of the movies that, well, I guess it's probably the only one that's kind of close to being a true story. But these are kind of like I said earlier, my 4 go-to films. And, you know, I don't guess there's a surprise there, but they're all about sports. They kind of deal with sport and the emotions of sport. And, well, I mentioned Rudy. You know, it's a story of a kid whose dream is to play football for Notre Dame. Yeah, you know, wouldn't be my dream, but nevertheless, he grew up in Indiana and believed he wanted to play football for Notre Dame. And if you haven't seen the movie, you must be living under a rock. But, you know, it's a true story. And, you know, in fact, my good friend David Gerard, who lives up in Louisville, who he grew up in Atlanta, was a big Georgia Tech fan, was actually at the game that the movie was kind of based on when he finally gets in his last few plays of his senior year. Otherwise, he's been on the scrub team. And he got to satisfy his dream of being on the playing field as a Notre Dame player. So if you haven't seen it, it's practically a true story. I think they've taken a little bit of poetic license, but there again, based on a true story. Now, the second movie, if those of you who remember it, is called Hoosiers. And it's a classic basketball underdog story. You know the one. You know, Gene Hackman is a kind of a down and out coach that's given one more chance to pursue his first love, and that is to coach basketball in a small town in Indiana. And the third movie, again, I know I've seen this movie probably 20 times. I actually own this movie on DVD and also in my DVR collection. It's Remember the Titans. Denzel Washington was the main character. And it's a football movie. And it's really kind of a masterpiece movie about leadership and unity and courage that was set in the early 70s when this country was torn by racial prejudice and hate. And the fourth movie, not too much unlike Remember the Titans, was a movie called Woodlawn. And similar to Remember the Titans, this movie is a story that's it's rooted right here in Birmingham, where I'm not my hometown, but adjacent to my hometown. Those of you who know me know I grew up in Fairfield, but it's like next door neighbors. And it's about two high school football teams, racial tension, the Jesus movement, strange bedfellows there, and all of those were kind of ripping their way through our city here in Birmingham in the early 70s, and in our state for that matter. So, but growing up, in and around Birmingham, I lived through many of the, I guess you would call them the tensions that these movies portrayed. And, I personally witnessed the tension the country was facing as the federal courts were, attempting to legislate morality with a stick instead of a carrot. And so there was a lot of moving parts during these times. But, honestly, I think during the period where the schools and the forced integration of the blacks and the whites in the schools were going on, the parents seemed to have more trouble with it than perhaps the students did in many ways. But that's a different story and a different a different conversation. The movie I want to unpack today, though, is this movie called Woodlawn. And if you haven't seen it, you should. I think it's probably available in local sources and all, but we'll talk on that later in just a second. But and the movie is specifically about a character in the movie named Hank, and he was the Woodlawn team chaplain. That was his role in the movies. Now, most folks in Birmingham, going to change the subject just a little bit here, but it'll relate in just a moment. But there's a lot of people that might remember a gentleman here in Birmingham. His name was Wales Goebel, and he had an evangelistic ministry, kind of an independent, non-denominational ministry. And he was really a home builder that had kind of had an encounter with the Lord and turned preacher. And he showed up on the scene here locally. I mean, he was even at my alma mater at Fairfield. I remember him being in an assembly there back when you could actually talk about Jesus, in a school, public school. And he had this assembly in the auditorium, and it was packed, and there was a lot of strong emotional pull that he stirred up, that day, and positive emotional pull about our need for God and our need to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But what hit me the hardest, I guess, in the movie wasn't Wales Goebel, but it was a man that kind of worked with Wales Goebel because he became a team chaplain at Woodlawn High School and for some other schools as well, I'm thinking. And his name was Hank, as I said. And there's a scene in the movie where Hank is asked if he ever played sports, because in the movie, played by Sean Astin, Patty Duke's son, by the way, same guy that was in Rudy, I think. I believe that's right. But anyway, uh, the the character Hank was asked by one of the players if he ever played sports, and he said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I had a baseball scholarship." And he had an accident that injured himself, and it destroyed his baseball career, and he lost his scholarship. And during that scene in the movie, I'm I'm watching and listening, obviously, and it dawned on me who Hank was. And it kind of hit me like a brick when he said that he had a baseball scholarship, because I realized I knew the real Hank, not movie Hank, but Hank Erwin. Now, I've got a flashback here to about 1967, maybe the summer of 66, 67. And if I recall, I was a junior to be in this particular summer coming up. And it was, like I said, it was in 67. And I was working at a steel mill. Actually, it wasn't a mill. It was a fabricating plant named Hannah Steel in Fairfield. And Hannah was the place. What they did, they took these large coils of steel and they would reprocess them into sheets and plates of different sizes, depending on the specifications of the order that they were receiving. And some of the plates they were using, they would take those coils and they would literally put them on a big machine that split them up into little thin coils, and then we would band them all back together. And Hank and I worked side by side on the line where these massive steel coils were unwrapped and slid into narrow strips and then rebundled back together. And these weren't little coils. They were for probably 6-7 foot in diameter. And of course, they were heavy enough to crush a person. And we would move them back and forth off of this machine using a block and tackle on a swinging arm that allowed us to reposition them as we loaded them on and then unloaded them off of the spindle of this machine. And so this block and tackle was welded into the overhead superstructure of the building up into the steel beams. Now, here's the deal. I left the job early August when two-a-day practices started at my local high school where I was playing football. And this was at Fairfield High School. But Hank stayed because he was in college, and so he wasn't due back in school, and he was on a baseball scholarship. And so I left to go work out and to be available for practices that we're having during the day. And Hank left and continued to work on that machine, and that's when it happened. The block and tackle that he was using to move those large coils failed, and a steel coil dropped, and it crushed Hank's foot so badly that, well, he lost his future in baseball. And of course the scholarship, I think back during that time, if you didn't play, you didn't get paid. So I'm under the assumption that he lost the scholarship as well. And at the time, all I knew was that, the guy I worked with got hurt. Now, years later, watching Woodlawn, I realized the injury that Hank described in the movie and the one that happened at Hannah Steel were one and the same. And that's when I kind of connected the dots. And, well, that was kind of like I guess the rest of the story. In the movie Woodlawn, of course, he gave his life to Christ, and he became a preacher. And in this case, he served as a chaplain in the Birmingham schools. And he kind of became a central figure in the spiritual awakening that kind of swept through the two schools that were in play here. There was Woodlawn, a city school, and then there was Banks, which was another city school, and both of them were perennial, big time football schools, and city champions and what have you. And Hank was serving as their chaplain. And I'm not going to spoil the plot of the movie, much less the ending of the movie. But I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to watch that movie, Woodlawn. You can probably rent it on Amazon Prime or find it on Netflix, maybe, or maybe even, rent it or buy it from Apple TV. But regardless of where you find it, be sure to watch it, because it's a moving story about two competing teams that were led by two gifted athletes who became famous in Alabama football lore following their, illustrious high school careers. There was Tony Nathan and there was Jeff Rutledge. Tony played at Woodlawn, Jeff played at Banks, and they were vicious competitors, but yet they were brothers in Christ. And that's all I'm going to tell you about the plot. But you got to go see the movie. But more importantly, it was a story about relationships that these two men and their two teams had, and even their coaches experienced it, along with their personal relationship with Jesus Christ and their family. Now, Hank's sons, this is Hank Erwin, grew up to become, his sons grew up and became filmmakers. And we know them today as the Erwin brothers, who have produced a lot of Christian-based movies that perhaps you've seen. They're always putting out great stuff, and Woodlawn was just one of many, but the one that really touched me. And this, and essentially, was kind of biographical in the sense that this was their father's story that they unfolded in the plot of this movie, Woodlawn. A story of a city that was torn with racial differences, and a story of how God can use one man to make a difference in the lives of so many individuals. That's not a coincidence. I mean, it's God's handwriting all over it. And it's kind of a modern day example of God working with and directing imperfect people to execute his will for all of us. I thought there's a devotional moment here that came to me. The will of God is captured in this statement. The will of God is oftentimes found in the detours we face in life. And here's the deeper truth that's buried in all of this, really. God has always taken ordinary people, interrupted their lives, and rerouted them for something far greater than they ever planned. It's like God hitting the reset button on their lives. I mean, look at characters in the Bible like Joseph. His life essentially collapsed. He was betrayed by his brother. He was sold into slavery. He was put in prison. But God used that detour to save a nation. And another would be Moses. He went from, palace privileges there in Egypt to 40 somewhat quiet years in the desert before God called him to lead Israel out of Egypt. And of course, there's Paul, the apostle. 1 minute he was like the rising star of the Pharisees, the religious right at the time. The next, he was blind on the Damascus road, and God took him and literally rebuilt him from scratch, from his Jewish upbringing, his Jewish education, his Jewish heritage, and he became one of the most prolific writers. And of course, the multiple books of the Bible that he penned and authored, espousing the theology and the teachings that he received personally from Jesus during that time where he was blinded and couldn't see and was basically having his life rerouted for him in real time. And then there's Peter. Wow, what about Peter? A fisherman fell flat on his face, denied Christ 3 times, and yet became the leader of the early church. And Scripture really is full of these moments where life breaks in, wrecks the plan, God steps into the wreckage and writes a better story. Every one of those men discovered the same thing that Hank Erwin did, and the same thing that you and I hopefully eventually learn. What looks like disaster is often God rerouting us into our real calling. Detours aren't the end of the story. They may be the doorway to God's best work. And if you're standing in one of those little twists in the roads right now, don't assume God stepped out of the room. This may be the moment He's preparing for your greatness, your greatest chapter of your life. So when I watched Woodlawn, I don't just see the actors. I see real people, real pain, and a real God who weaves His purposes through every little twist and turn. What do you think? Do you believe that? Open your mind and your heart and see what God can do in your life. Even when you feel like you've hit a brick wall, He's still there. I appreciate you joining me tonight. We've got a couple of comments here. My buddy David Downs says, I'll never forgive Notre Dame and the refs for knocking us out of the national championship. Yeah, I hated Notre Dame for many, many years. I'm not real fond of them right now. I don't know how and why they get rated above Alabama in the polls in real time here. My buddy Mike McGinnis, dear brother, thank you, Mike. I appreciate your kind words. Mike and I, believe it or not, we were both students at Stanford, and we were both divinity students. And he pursued a career in the mission field for many years in South America or Central America, and I went off the deep end and went through some dark times in my life spiritually. But Mike has always been a great friend. But when he and I were in college, we used to go street preaching down in North Birmingham. And it was always kind of, I guess, humorous in a way, because some nights we would go down to where the adult bookstores were located and stand out front and talk to people about Jesus, and more times than not, people ducking us because they were embarrassed. And we would hand out tracts, and we were just on fire for the Lord. We had a mission, and thank God Mike pursued that mission, and shame on me for failing to see the light. But nevertheless, God has his ways with us, and I'm back. Again, Mike, thanks for your kind words. Look, I'll leave you with this. We are going to be coming up on Thanksgiving weekend. I will be and do plan on being here next Sunday night, probably full of turkey and dressing and all the fixings. And so I look forward to seeing you then on Senior Moments. We're live at 5, and I hope you guys have a great week and a great Thanksgiving. And I hope you all enjoy time with your family. And I hope you will come back and visit with us soon here on Senior Moments. Oh, got one other comment here from my buddy Robert Sherman up in the Louisville area, a fellow magician friend of mine. He and his wife are great people up there. And Robert, thanks for watching tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it. And those of you who are watching this on the replay, I hope you will enjoy it too as well. So y'all have a great evening, and see you next Sunday, 5 o'clock, for Senior Moments. More evidence of a misspent youth. Have a good evening. Well, hey, thanks for spending a few minutes with me on Senior Moments. If you enjoyed the ride, be sure and tap that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. I'll be back soon with more stories from a misspent youth, and maybe some of yours too.